And tonight from Washington, D.C., Bradley Bowman with the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Bradley is also a military analyst and a former national security advisor on Capitol Hill. Gentlemen, welcome. I want to ask all of you to start off with, what kind of China did you see today? And Bradley, let me start with you. What picture was presented to you today?
It was a picture of an economically powerful, militarily powerful, authoritarian government that is clearly trying to demonstrate the capabilities that they've assembled in recent years, many of which are specifically targeted at the United States and our allies. It's a country that wants to push the U.S. out of the region so that it can bully its neighbors.
Bernard, what did you see today?
I agree. It's a very powerful and very rich China. That's the picture that they want to show the world. I think this whole parade had two sides to it. The one that they showed the world, that's the military side. And internally, they also want to project that they are on a successful route, which at the moment they are not. What do you do at the moment where you have internal problems? You project external strength.
Well, I thought it was interesting, given that the narrative for months now has been that China is suffering in the trade war with the US. I think this was very much aimed at showing that China is strong, that it's able to stand up to the US militarily, as we saw with the Dongfang 41 missiles, which can reach the US in 30 minutes. And also for the internal market to show, for the domestic market, for the would-be supporters of the Communist Party, that it's strong and it's able to fight its corner in the trade war.
Bradley, let's talk a little bit about the new weapons that China showed off in that parade today. What does it mean for the balance of powers in Asia, especially for the U.S.? I mean, you hinted at it there, but talk to me a little bit about what China showed us today.
I think China's aim is to change the balance of power in the Taiwan Strait, in the South China Sea, and in other places to push the United States and our allies and partners further and further back from its shores. And as the balance of power in their minds shifts further and further in Beijing's direction, I think it makes it more likely that we would see aggression from Beijing in the future. And I think it's important to make clear that, at least from my perspective, the enemy is not the Chinese people. The Chinese are a great people with a great history and a great civilization. The villain here, in my view, is the Chinese Communist Party, which has undertaken the largest theft of intellectual property in human history and is oppressing their people while violating international norms and rules. And this is not the U.S. versus China. At least it should not be U.S. versus China. This should be China versus the world, and that should manifest itself in our policies in the South China Sea, the Taiwan Strait, and elsewhere.
Do you think there's any alarm going off in the Pentagon tonight after what was displayed today? I mean, particularly with this ICBM missile and talk of it being able to reach the U.S. In less than half an hour?
I was in the Pentagon this morning for meetings, and a lot of these weapons are well known to the U.S. defense establishment. These are not weapons that are produced in 6 months. These are things that take years to develop. Some of these we've seen before. Some are appearing publicly for the first time. The DF-17 hypersonic glide missile is particularly concerning. That would appear to be more capable than anything the U.S. currently has. So we, the United States and our allies, we have our work cut out for us, and no doubt about that. But I think it's important, just very quickly, to, it's very concerning, this is, but just three things for good news for the viewers out there, Democratic allies and partners that might be a little concerned. One is the U.S. military is undertaking in the last 2 years a robust readiness and modernization campaign that's well underway and is bearing good fruit. We have the most robust system of allies and partners in the world. Beijing wishes they had the alliances that we have. And I don't think we should ever underestimate what a free people and free markets can do once we wake up to a threat to our vital interests.
Okay. Bernhard, I want us to talk a little bit now about the picture inside the country. I want you to take a look at what our correspondent sent us from the protests today in Hong Kong, and then we'll talk.
Not so long ago, we were in a busy shopping district packed with protesters, and we saw one woman as we approached. She was clearing her eyes, getting that tear gas out of her eyes with water. She had a car number plate wrapped around her which said the words love. Then she advanced towards the police, the riot police, going back for more. She was confronting them, yelling at them. There was a brief pause, and then the riot police started firing that tear gas. Some of it, the canisters, came very, very close to hitting journalists. From where we were standing, we couldn't quite tell if those journalists were hit, but those tear gas canisters did explode very close. The woman in pink who'd been confronting police once again, without a mask, hit by that tear gas. It really was very astounding scenes.
I mean, there's compelling images there, and couple that with this statistic. In 1997, almost 50% of Hong Kongers said they were proud to be Chinese. Today, that number is only 27%. I mean, does Beijing have a plan to win the hearts and minds of Hong Kongers? I mean, when you see images like what we just saw, I mean, I don't see a plan there in action.
They had a plan, it just didn't work. The plan was propaganda. That is what they do. And this is, of course, Beijing's worst nightmare. They thought they had Hong Kong covered. They've exposed them to 20 years of propaganda there, and it didn't work. So the real nightmare for them is, what does this mean for control in the mainland? It's not like this is going to spill over there. For the time being, they have the narrative under control. But Beijing absolutely had no clue that something like this could come up and could persist for such a long time.
So you don't think they think it's a contagion that could spread?
I think they can contain it in Hong Kong, but that they didn't have this on their books worries them, because in China, where they control public opinion so much, they probably don't have a clue how much dissatisfaction there is. And propaganda, Hong Kong shows that, only buys you that much.
Yeah.
If there's a little bit of freedom, people will use that.
Clifford, let's talk about the economics of Hong Kong. You know, it was an economic gem in the crown back in 1997. It's not that anymore. It's now also the most expensive city in the world, and I read 250,000 people are on a waiting list for public housing. So what does that mean Xi Jinping has to do if there's not going to be a military option like Tiananmen Square 1989?
Well, I think if you think back to, it's only 2 years since Xi Jinping visited Hong Kong and celebrated the city, said there was a red line across which people could not cross, and we've seen that red line crossed again and again. So what does that mean for the party, which a lot of people have overestimated, I think, have underestimated the importance of Hong Kong. It's actually still very, very important, because it's still the main conduit for a lot of the money leaving China, not only going into China, and it's also very important regionally in itself. Shanghai isn't there yet. Shanghai has tried repeatedly to unseat Hong Kong, but it hasn't succeeded. So economically, Hong Kong is crucial. And it has a very important psychological role in the makeup of the whole country. So I think it's a real problem about how do you deal with this errant child, and I don't really see where the answers are going to come from, short of military intervention. But military intervention again is such a huge step. It would also severely damage the markets.
Well, I mean, you don't get the impression that Xi Jinping has his thumb or his finger on any military button right now. I mean, it would make sense for him to find ways to pump money and resources into Hong Kong to address issues. You know, young people can't afford to buy an apartment in Hong Kong, for example. So maybe, is it possible that he's thinking, let's do the economics and make them happy that way, and eventually the politics will follow?
Well, I think that's the way the thinking goes in Beijing, that you can use money. But I think what these demonstrations have really shown is that actually young people don't really seem to care about the money. I mean, money might be a reason why you go out once or twice, but they're going out week after week, day after day. They're leaving school. They've shown that this is more than about money, And
it reminds me of something that I discussed with Joshua Wong, the pro-democracy activist. He was in Berlin a couple of weeks ago, and I put it to him that Hong Kongers have more in common with Londoners and New Yorkers than they do with their compatriots in China. And he didn't know what to do with that. And I said, it's because of the British. You were a colony for such a long time. The Brits created you. So do you think the Brits have any type of responsibility now? I mean, politically, in this? I mean, they're responsible for the existence of Hong Kong as we know it.
They didn't do a very good job leaving Hong Kong as a democracy. It wasn't a democracy under British rule. They have absolutely no political means to involve themselves there now. But you're right, of course. Hong Kong is a totally different animal of a society than the Chinese one.
Yeah.
And integrating the two of them just hasn't worked.
But how do you do that? How do you integrate this territory where they live like we do here with a one-party, totalitarian, a communist state? How do those two? That's like apples and oranges.
That's
how does
a very
that work?
Beijing kind of question.
But how does it work, though? I mean, how
to ask.
Yeah.
The magic formula would be just let Hong Kong be. They're making money for China. It doesn't really matter if they become a bit democratic. Beijing is so obsessed with bringing Hong Kong under its control, and this, of course, extends to Taiwan. It wouldn't really hurt them. It's just a nationalist thing that they want to have it under control, and they have their own idea of what control means.
Let me ask you, too, and I'll pull Bradley back in for this one, too, about what the West, particularly the United States, thought about China 20, 30 years ago. I remember Bill Clinton was once quoted as saying, if you give them Coca-Cola and maybe Britney Spears, then democracy will follow. But that hasn't happened. Is China the exception, or is China more the rule when you're talking about changing entire societies?
I would say it's not the exception. It hasn't worked the way we looked at it, but it doesn't mean that people want to have a say in their lives. It's just that the Beijing system is much, much better at controlling the country than any other dictatorship has been before.
Yeah, and Bradley, what happened to America's pivot to Asia? We talked about that so often under Obama. Did we just let that go when we should have stayed focused?
Yeah, I was working on Capitol Hill in the Senate during those years, and Republicans, I think, were rightly critical of the Obama administration at the time and saying that the so-called pivot to Asia was more rhetoric than reality. Part of that was the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. What happened here in the U.S. was, in my view, the Obama administration and Congress did not provide the sufficient and timely funding required to fund current operations, maintain readiness, and modernize the force. And so China and Russia used that time to go to school, if you will, on the way America fights and to modernize their forces. And what has happened as a result is we've seen an erosion of U.S. military superiority. And that's not just bad from an American perspective. I think that's bad for the world, because the more powerful that China believes they are militarily, the more likely I think they are to take military risks.
And what about high tech? And that'll be the last topic because we're running out of time. Bradley, we've talked before about 5G technology, networks, and Huawei and China dominating that. China at 70. Let's talk about China at 80. Do you see, besides the military aspect, do you see the tech and the privacy and surveillance, do you see that as the big battlefield between the West and China moving forward?
The China challenge, in my view, goes well beyond the military domain, and I think we focus exclusively on the military domain at our own peril. I think we and our European allies should banish the concept of a Chinese private sector. There is no such thing as a Chinese private sector. The companies are either working currently for the CCP, or they're one phone call from Beijing away from working for the CCP, and the sooner we realize that, the better.
All right. Clifford, what do you say about that? I mean,
well, it's a very interesting argument. I think certainly we're seeing more and more party influence. Xi Jinping is centering everything upon himself, and where we used to have the big capitalist heroes like Jack Ma and Wang Jianlin.
That's right.
Suddenly they're all kind of taking a back seat, and everything is becoming very, very party focused. So I think one can definitely argue that there is a very, very strong state element now to everything going forward in how the economy is run.
Bernhard, I mean, China at 80, we're talking about Xi Jinping president for life.
Could be, I'm not sure though, because this is all going in the direction of planned economy again. And it hasn't worked the first time, and we're seeing a lot of inefficiencies now. I wouldn't bet all my money on it working the second time.
All right, gentlemen. Bernhard Barsch, the China expert with the Bertelsmann Institute. Clifford Coonan with DW Business, and in Washington, Bradley Bowman with the Foundation for Defense of Democracies.